My name's David Johnson. I recently started volunteering here at the Utah Christian Research Center, and I'm glad to do so, to be with others of like-minded and like backgrounds as myself. As a history, I should start, I was born in Utah, born in Lehi. The hospital that I was born at has since been torn down. I think for a while they had it as a haunted hospital. It was there on the main drag that went through Lehi, and they tore it down. Had my tonsils removed there as a kid also. My parents, we moved to Provo, and that's basically the only town that I'm familiar with. My dad was a steel worker. He worked at U.S. Steel for 40 plus years, and my mother was a traditional housewife. We were born where I was raised at I would say the wrong end of Provo, down by the airport. When I was a kid, it was a great place to live. In fact, we were on a dirt road at that time. And we were about 2 miles from the airport. A lot of times you could walk through those fields and scare at pheasants, but those days are long gone. When I was a kid, the kids there, your parents either worked for BYU or U.S. Steel. There was a few others that support there, but that was basically what Provo was in those days. It was a great place to be raised and grow up. Matriculated through the system, graduated Provo High. I was one of the youngest in my class, and so after that I was able to get a year in at BYU also before I served a mission. Just before my mission, I met my future wife, and she waited for me for the 2 years, and when I got home from the mission, we did get married. But to backtrack a little bit, I served this was probably the monumental, most important thing in my life was the mission that I served. I served in upstate New York. My first area was only 20 miles from the Hill Cumorah, which we visited often. As I'm getting this a little out of sequence, which is, no notes here, just doing this from bullet points in my head, which are kind of moving around a little bit. As I think about my first spiritual experiences, as a young adult, I was in a seminary class at Provo High School, release time, they call it now. It was a New Testament class, and the teacher, his name evades me right now, but he was really one of these cool guys because he was only a part-time seminary teacher. He also was the assistant baseball coach for BYU baseball, and he drove a really nice Corvair Spider, okay? So it got our attention. That wouldn't mean anything to people probably that are listening here, but that was a neat car, And so I remember there was an assignment then, and we were in Matthew 16. And the same question that was posed to Philip, to Peter at Caesarea Philippi was, who do men say that I am? And he says, I want you to write on that. So we, took 20, 30 minutes and we wrote down a little essay, in-class essay. And in those days, rooms were big. There were probably 35 kids in this classroom. And all of a sudden he says, well, let me read one of these. So he pulls one out, and all of a sudden I'm hearing my own words read back to me. And I said, man, did I write that? And I think that was probably, because it's memorable in my mind, that must have been the point, basically, when I made a conscious decision that this is important stuff, that this is something that I should listen to. And from then on, I really did. I did scripture study, read, desired to go on a mission. In those days, the wards, this is right just at the beginning of the Vietnam War, and the wards were only allowed a quota of one 19-year-old boy every 6 months that they could send out. Well, none of my friends wanted to go. And so I got the deferment, went in the mission field. Shortly after that, I won the lottery. I think I was number 309, so it didn't matter. I was never going to get drafted. But I served in upstate New York. This is a big deal. And the main thing is the person that I served under. His name was Reed Bankhead. He was a civil engineer. I think he was one of the first engineers that worked on the BYU Stadium. He was one of those. And so having an engineering mind, he taught us in this logical, A, B, C equals this, and this logical linear method, and it suited my learning style. I appreciated it. Later I went to school and became a math major in college, but that's another story. And so that appealed to me. And he was a devout Book of Mormon guy. Because we were in Book of Mormon land, we were required basically to memorize a Book of Mormon verse every day. And I got conversant enough that, 9 out of 10 times you could open the Book of Mormon and read it and I could tell you where you were at. But, those days are gone. But anyway, and we taught some very fundamental doctrines then. Doctrines that were just, as I've heard it said, the Protestantism that is found in the Book of Mormon. Probably the most important idea was this idea of being born again. As Alma the Younger and Alma the Elder and several other, are constantly stressing this idea that there has to be a change in your heart. And there's also throughout the Book of Mormon, there's this term that man is carnal, sensual, and devilish. This starts, I think, Abinadi teaches this, and this goes on through the Book of Alma, this idea that man is carnal, sensual, and devilish, fallen man. And this became kind of shorthand in our mission field as people became CS and D, okay? Carnal, sensual, and devilish. And it's a true doctrine. It really is true. And that bore fruit. A little instance there. In our mission, we put on the Hill Cumorah pageant. This was probably the father of all the pageants that the church had, was this Hill Cumorah pageant. And we got to take 2 weeks out. So we had 180 missionaries, and they put us up in the College of Rochester dormitories, and then they would bus us out to the Hill Cumorah, and we would practice putting on scenes for the Hill Cumorah pageant. Also at this time, they would bus out maybe 2 busloads of sisters from BYU. Now, this is a joke, and maybe others won't realize it. We said we were the only missionaries that had 2 weeks off with girls. But that was, and it was all on the up and up. But these attractive girls came out, and they had this propensity. They would get in the buses and they would commute to families that they were staying with, and they would always sing, "I am a child of God." This is a song that's very conversant. All Mormons know this. Some of the lyrics were changed later on to do and know. Anyway, that's another thing. I remember our mission president. He was a character. He was from Idaho. He liked to ranch, and you can know he's always being serious. He'd start rubbing his face, and he'd say, "Elders," he says, "that song," referring to "I am a child of God," he says, "that's really false doctrine." He says, the only way you become a child of God, and then he takes us to Mosiah 5 and other chapters in Mosiah, where you don't become a child of God until you're born again. It isn't automatic. This stuck with me. This man really, and then he would take us to Romans 8, and where it says, "For the Spirit beareth witness to our spirits that we are His children." Anyway, this really stuck home with me. I mean, this is truth. This is important truth. This is where we live, okay? In Galatians 3, the same idea, this idea that we are God's children, and we're adopted in. It isn't automatic. Anyway, I'll file that story away for a minute. I'll refer back to that. I came home. We immediately got married. Started our family immediately. I have 7 children. I got 2 boys, 5 girls. Okay, all successful. One's a hospital administrator, one's a lawyer, anyway. One daughter's a welder, so there's a diversity there. I have another boy that's in tech. Another boy works for the government. Anyway, so good kids. One's a nurse. Anyway, so I matriculated. I had fulfilled many church jobs. I was, early on when we were first married, I was in the elders quorum presidency, and we moved shortly after that as always a Sunday school teacher. Later I was put in, and those people don't understand the structure. The structure used to be in Mormonism where they would have 70s. They would have elders, 70s, and high priests. The 70s, which were maybe one or two guys that would be in a ward unit, they would be in charge of the missionary work. And so I was made a 70 out here in Riverton when we moved out here to Riverton. And I did that for many years. In fact, I was the stake mission leader for a while in the Riverton area. And we rubbed shoulders with a lot of polygamists because you can't help that, living in Riverton. And that was always the thing. But we always, some fun stories. One story comes to mind. Me and this other guy, we were knocking on this door, and I was told to give some of these anecdotes, so I digress here, but this is a funny story. We knock on the door, and we had to prove who we were, that we were LDS, and oh yeah, come in, I'm Mormon too, come in. He says, I want to let you know that I have a perpetual motion machine. The 3 Nephites came to my house and gave me this perpetual motion machine, and all the oil companies are trying to kill me. Well, anyway, so this is, of course, it doesn't matter. It wouldn't matter who, just sketchy stories like that. Anyway, the true story, okay, not made up. I remember it to this day. But it was good times, and maybe I should have said this in the introduction. I enjoyed being a Mormon, okay? It was good for me. I had camaraderie with a lot of men, missionary companions. We were good friends, to quote a little Shakespeare, we were a band of brothers, and we had shared those experiences, and we had taught, and anyway, it was a good time. It was enjoyable. And so the cultural part of Mormonism sunk deep into me. And again, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. My great-grandfather walked into this valley in 1855. His family was converted to Mormonism in England. The surname really should be Johnsey. That got changed. That's another story. But they immigrated to Alberta area down there, and I still have the land grant deed signed by Ulysses S. Grant, which is probably a clerk. It wasn't Grant's signature, but I've got the deed on my property for a quarter section of acres of acreage that they owned there, and so our roots go deep. My mother's family. His father was a Danish convert, and he was raised up in Logan in a Danish ward. They had actually kind of would segment, they would put like people together, and he was raised probably in a bilingual household because he later went to Denmark on a mission. But, that's the roots of Mormon. And my wife's is very similar to mine. She was from the Orem area. And so Mormonism was really part of it. We liked the culture. We were ingrained in it. We really did enjoy it. Well, now's the time to say I have all these seeds planted. I remember when I was on my mission, I remember we were in a mall, and we had the display, and we were trying to advertise the Hilcamore pageant. And that was a good break from knocking on doors. And so I remember this guy come up behind me and says, "Do you really believe this stuff?" He says, "Do you really believe it?" And I just said, wow. Well, it's time to take stock of that. I mean, it's interesting how somebody puts a little rock in your shoe, and you've got to live with that for a while. I remember I was in a little town called Trumansburg, New York. It's up from Ithaca, right across from Cornell University. And in this little town, the houses were far apart, and it was cold. It gets blinking cold in upstate New York. And we would knock these doors, and this guy says, come in, guys, you're getting cold. He says, and his daughter was a a doctor that had volunteered, and she was in Saudi Arabia, doing stuff in a clinic of all places, Saudi Arabia. She says, "Why do you guys do this? We believe in Christ. Why are you here?" And it's little stories like that that just kind of, at the time, and as I say them, people will blow these stories off, but when you're a young 19-year-old, 20-year-old, they sink to your heart. You kind of take retrospect. What are you? Anyway, people planted a lot of seeds. Anyway, and also in Ithaca, a lot of people didn't know the Jehovah's Witnesses had what we would call a church farm up there. And we ran into a horrific amount of Jehovah's Witnesses. It was, if we was bored, we'd go argue with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so I sharpened my debate skills, I guess. Those have since fled, and I don't desire to do that anymore. But nevertheless, we would, it was a good time. And it was a good time because we were studying and we were with friends. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Later became a mission assistant and came home. Well, to backtrack, the wife and I, we got married, we lived in Orem for a while, moved to Salt Lake. We had an apartment. It was a duplex right where the St. Mark's Hospital is on 39th South. We lived there for a while. And then we were able to rent a house out in Bluffdale area. It had a half acre, and all of a sudden we decided, we're going to get a few animals. So by then we had 3 girls, and life was good. I worked, as I haven't mentioned yet, I worked for the railroad. I started out there. In those days, I worked for the Denver and Rio Grande. That later they bought the Southern Pacific, so I worked for the Southern Pacific. And then there was a merger there, and then at my last occupation, I worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. And I was a railroad conductor. And life was good, income was good. I had dropped out of school because of the children. I'm just a few credits shy of getting a BS degree in mathematics, but that doesn't pay the bills. And later we bought some acreage. This story is going somewhere. We bought some acreage down the street in Bluffdale. We bought 5 acres and an old home. And so we got a few cows, and I would milk the cows. And you got to have something. You just can't sit there and look at this stupid cow and milk the cow. So I turned the radio on. In those days, there was, we called it anti-Mormon. There's this guy from Southern California, and I've asked others, that others don't remember, and his name was John Henry Yount. And he would have a theme song, and it went something like this. He says, "There is peace all around when you're born again." Anyway, so he kind of co-opted the Mormon song. And anyway, he says, "Well, who is this guy?" Anyway, and so he was only on for 15 minutes. And then right after him, because it takes longer than 15 minutes to do your chores, Chuck Swindoll came on. And so, well, you can see where this story's going. We listened to him, and finally my wife says, "Oh, this is good stuff." We had this argument, who found Chuck Swindoll. It's not going to be resolved, but it was me, okay? Anyway, I give her the kudos that she called in and got the study guides. And we would study. In fact, even to this day, I probably got this many study guides of Chuck Swindoll from that. And man, this changed our lives. This was the gospel, In many things, it rang true with the stuff that I had learned in the Book of Mormon, but he was saying it so much with such more clarity. And so, as families do, you have to make the pilgrimage to Southern California to go to Disneyland. So we take all our kids there. That's just your obligation as a parent, is to go to Disneyland. But Chuck Swindoll's church was only 5 miles up the road from Disneyland then. It was in Fullerton, California. And that's where he was preaching. We went there, and man, what a fantastic spirit. I'll never forget, anyway. And I had other reasons I had to go to California, and I always made a point that I would get there Sunday so I could go to Swindoll's church. And it was always disappointing when they had a stand-in preacher, but it was still good. It was still good, but that's just the nature of it. Anyway, and so I honestly think that's basically where this transformation came. And in the interim, I had other church jobs. Finally, I think we had a very young neighborhood, and I say this, I was the oldest guy there in the neighborhood, and so it just felt to me they made me bishop, okay? I became the bishop in that neighborhood. And God's hand was there, but I served faithfully and hard as a bishop. But I remember trying to teach some of these doctrines I found in the Book of Mormon. I remember this woman had just blessed her baby, and I says, you know that baby's carnal, sensual, and devilish, don't you? And she just looked at me like I had just, used a lot of four-letter words, And she was just, anyway, but I was constantly trying to superimpose some of these doctrines, that I'd learned that are in the Book of Mormon. It isn't me making this up. These are found in the pages of the Book of Mormon. And this kind of grew and grew. I was listening to Swindoll. In those days, he quoted a lot of William Barclay. He's kind of out of disfavor now, but still, so we got the whole commentary of William Barclay's commentary on the New Testament. And slowly we went through that. In fact, on Sunday mornings when I was bishop, I have a Bible study group. And the cat's out. Anyway, to explain this, I'd go and read, half a dozen pages of Barclay, put the book away, then all the people would come in, then I'd sound how smart I was, because I would, basically I had a good enough memory that I could walk them through, but it was, the teacher always learns more than the students. And eventually we did go through, we went through all of Barclay's commentaries, and man, this is good stuff. This is good stuff. And by then we've got girls that are going off to college, and our family's growing. Our youngest was born there. Right now my oldest is 52 and my youngest is 40. So that's kind of the spread that I have. And so there's 7 kids there. So you can do the math pretty easy. We had one every 2 years. Anyway, so I was released at bishop, and just before that, my wife decided, says, when you're released, I'm going to stop going to be a Mormon. She respected me long enough and she goes to church, she participated, she did she was always involved, always did always supportive, and God's blessing for a supportive, loving wife. Anyway, so she just stopped attending. And at that time, I would, it just slips my mind. The church at the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon, it's, what is it? Oh.
Canyons?
What's that now?
Canyons?
No, it's not Canyons. They have the school.
Christian?
Yeah, Intermountain Christian. Thank you. I don't know, it just slipped my mind. Anyway, I would go to church with her. I had been released as a bishop. I'd go to church with her, and they had the best Sunday school teacher we ever had. He was Bob Keener. He's a math professor at BYU. Excuse me. Whoa, strike that from the record. He was a professor of mathematics at the University of Utah. Fantastic Sunday school. And we got enveloped in this Christian music. And anyway, I just thoroughly enjoyed going to church with him. But then I would come back and go to church, the LDS church. So I had my feet in both, in both cultures. Anyway, finally they had me teach. The story progresses. I taught adult Sunday school for a year or so. Finally, they made me the teacher of the young adults. And I'll never forget, this is where I get back to the story that I mentioned earlier. Finally, one of the girls were singing, "I am a child of God." And all of a sudden, this memory came back to me, how this was false doctrine. Basically, childhood, God adopts us. None of us are children out of the womb. We have to go through this being born again. That's what that actually means. This is a real thing. And I explained that to the class, went through the scriptures that had been taught me, 30 years earlier, from the Book of Mormon, I might add. And one of the kids in the class was the bishop's daughter. So I got called into the bishop's office. And he said, why are you teaching that? What's this? This song is right there to Scripture. It's in our hymnal. I mean, why? And then I explained exactly, the Scriptures in Mosiah, and again reinforced that with the teachings of Paul and how we are adopted. And I says, explain to me why I'm wrong. He says, and basically he told me he says, you just think too much about Christ. Just, okay. And I says, oh, okay. I'll never forget, I went home and my wife quizzically asked, what did he say to you? And I says, well, he told me that I just think too much about Christ. He said, what? Anyway, back in the background, there's a lot of moving parts to this story. My wife had asked for her records to be removed, and this is kind of interesting. And finally, 2 years after she'd asked for her records to be removed, it hadn't happened. So she wrote a second letter for her records to be removed from the church. Finally, I got a call from my state president. And he says, do you want this? I says, well, I thought we believed in free agency. That's what she wants. What's the problem? I says, I can't lord over her. If she doesn't want to be a Mormon, why would you hold this up? And so finally she got her record saying that she had been released from the church. She had resigned, I guess, in those days. They never held a court or anything. She just resigned. What's another interesting bishop story, as I mentioned, and I guess I should tell these more sequentially, but no notes here. I'm just doing this, it's a flow of consciousness. In those days, in listening to Swindoll, I noticed that he was using a different Bible. In those days, he was using New American Standard Bible. And so I think the 95 hadn't come out, so it was the 77, New American Standard 77 Bible. And so I started carrying, I had my triple combination and my New American Standard Bible. And that's what I would teach from. Anyway, finally, the neighbor next door, it drove her nuts that I was using this New American Standard Bible in a Sunday school class. And so she turned me into the state president. I got called in. And what was interesting is that conference Sunday, there was several talks, and they all quoted different versions of the Bible. And so to my defense, I says, well, I referenced that. I says, here were general authorities that quoted different versions of the Bible. I says, that's all I'm doing. Basically, he says, get out of here, And so that happened. Well, I'm just trying to think of any cute anecdotes, but that's the short of it. And let me just take a little pause here. I had some counselors, these men I just truly loved. They were just servants. One you asked him to do something and it was done. He was just never sought any recognition himself. These are just some, it almost brings you to tears to, these good men. And they're so ingrained, their families have, there's just no way that they could see. I remember one of my counselors came over and I says, I've left the church. He says, you haven't left it, have you? He would not believe it. I mean, I had to show him the letter that I'd actually left the church, That's another story, and we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, I have nothing but love for these, and the trouble of it is that relationship now is, it's broken. It's broken, and I feel bad for that. There's still this, respect, but that association, that commonality we have, it's gone. And my fault, but that's the way it is. Finally, I started. I used the excuse why I didn't leave Mormonism. I honestly think I left in about 1992. But this is the era of Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart. And I says, why do I want to join up with these people? Why? I mean, this is an embarrassment. I know what I believe. I believe Chuck Swindoll, but I can't attend his church. It's 600 plus miles away. But where can I go to church? finally my insurance agent says, why don't you come to church with us? And I started attending. He was attending South Mountain. And I went there and I says, this is good stuff. This is when they were over here in the warehouse. They hadn't got their big campus in. And they're a little smaller, and smaller churches are always, I don't know, it seems like they're more personable. Not a criticism, but that's just a fact of life. That the smaller churches, you know the guy's name. You see him, they know you. And there was this good relationship. Finally, I got involved with that. I started going to a men's Bible study. And it was led by Paul Roby. And I remember he announced to the group, he says, guys, now let's be careful. He says, Dave is a Mormon. That's when you could say the word Mormon. Anyway, he's a Mormon, and let's be respectful. Anyway, what's interesting about that I went on a couple missions trips. I went to Mexico, Guatemala with this church, and I decided then I was going to get baptized. And that later happened in 2007. And I got, in fact, a long story, I was going to get baptized. I told all these guys, I want to get baptized. And we was going to go, we was down near the Gulf of Mexico, a little town outside of Chitamal, just above Belize. We was doing some missionary work there, building some structures for the local church there. And the bus was going to go out there. It was you always work hard for, 8 days, and then they always have a break day. So this was the break day, and we was going to go, and I said, well, I'm going to be baptized. I asked the leader to baptize me. Anyway, the bus broke down. So I never made that. Anyway, but it happened. I came back, and I decided to get baptized. It was April Fool's Day, 2007. It sticks in my mind. And April 1st is an important day for me, but that's another story. Anyway, so I got baptized then. What's interesting about this, one of these groups of guys, all these guys that I went to this missions trip showed up at my baptism, which was great. You would have done the same. There was this camaraderie we had. We'd worked, and all this together. One of them was an Italian guy, kind of boisterous, a character. And he worked in the post office over there in Sandy. And the neighbor around the corner from me, he worked at the post office also. Anyway, he says, hey, we baptized your bishop on Sunday. He said, these guys are sorting their mail and they're going through. You can see this. If you've been a blue collar guy, you can appreciate this maybe a little more, And anyway, he's just all frustrated, because he'd got the upper hand on him. He says, one for our side, you guys lost one, okay, kind of thing. Anyway, lo and behold, he couldn't stand it. This guy, he turned me into which I was going to do eventually anyway. Finally, I got turned into the stake president and got called in because this guy was so upset that he got humiliated at work that, his bishop had become a member, got baptized. Anyway, long story short, I got called in. Very respectful meeting. I explained to him how that, what I believed in and what I held, the idea of, the baptism all believers, a few ideas, and he looked at me like, where is this guy? This guy's from planet Mars or something. Anyway, but we just shook hands, and anyway, I sent him my letter, got a quick response. This is the irony of all ironies, I think. I got my letter from the church saying that I had 30 days to change my mind. 2 days later, I got the same letter again. So the computer stuttered. I don't know what happened at 50 East South Temple. Something happened there that I got this same letter twice. Anyway, but that was it. And from then on, I haven't looked back. We've been active. And the casualties of this, and I feel bad, is many of our children, they here the wife and I were going through this time of turmoil. We were mixed up what our beliefs are and what's this and our poor kids, the majority of them are just, I see some glimmers of hope. The last two, the they're Christians, but the rest I don't know. And that's my responsibility, and it's a heartache to think about that. But since then, I've been active. Went on another missions trip at South Mountain. The music there got a little too contemporary for us, and so we went to a more traditional church. No bad feelings. That's where I was baptized. That's where I basically became a Christian, was over at South Mountain. But now I'm active in a Bible church in Bluffdale and in leadership there. And anyway, that's the story, is, and I guess it's embarrassing, the fact that it took me so long. I hear these Christians, it's almost like some Christians have this road to Damascus experience, where one day they clicks their fingers and they can name the date. Some of them even name the hour that this happened. And I can't do that. I think back at my high school experience, where I was confronted who Christ was, and it just grew and grew slowly. So I wish I could tell somebody on day da-da-da-da-da, I became a Christian, but I can't do that. But it is true now, and maybe I kind of fall back into a little Mormon verbiage here. I bear witness that happened. I really do. And the scriptures are my joy, and I listen to several podcasts every day of good teachers. And anyway, life is good. And it's good. As I tell some of my neighbors, I says, when are you guys going to get off the treadmill? You guys are just going to work yourself. And it just, I see them. It's a heartbreak. And anyway, any questions you guys have or anything? Or
Can you talk about your change of who God is, your view of who God is?
Oh, for sure. I remember I've been involved in a Bible study, men's Bible study. It's kind of funny, as I mentioned, I started in 2002 with Paul Roby. Finally, it became the axiom that the last man standing gets to be the leader. And so I led that Bible study for about 10 years over there at South Mountain. And what was interesting about that, I remember we was watching the Truth Project with Focus on the Family put out. Jim Taggart, was that
Del Tackett?
That's the name. Thank you. Anyway, I'll never forget. And it's funny when you have these little epiphanies. He was holding this. He says, "Here's the box. We're in this box, but you know where God is? He's outside of that box." And finally, the light went on after all these times, and I was, I'd been baptized and all that. I'd been converted. Finally, that's the problem with Mormonism: is God is in the box with us. He's not. He stands outside of that. And, how, duh, why didn't I figure this out sooner? But, that's a big moment. It's hard. You get conditioned to what God is, and that he's this grandfatherly figure, and he's just, but he's not that. He's, what's the old song that was popular when we were becoming Christians? I mean, our God is an awesome God. He reigns. That all of a sudden this Christian, that was another dimension to our leaving. Was this is the days of Rick Mullins, Michael Card, even Amy Grant. This Christian music, granted, it's kind of, ear candy, but nevertheless, by and large, most of it has some good doctrine in it, and you encapsulate that. And it's the way we learn stuff. Sometimes we just learn visually, sometimes we learn through our ears, but somehow music hits a different part of our brain that changes our hearts, and all of a sudden, music is an important thing, I mean, some of the hymns now, are just, to keep my time when I was on the railroad, I'd play the harmonica, so I learned a lot of these old hymns, and some of them, were, Rock of Ages, Amazing Grace, some of them are they just ring truth to you, and I don't know, they just speak to your heart. Anyway, they ring. Anyway. what does the scientists call it? Sympathetic harmonic resonance, where the tuning fork rings over here, and if you're in tune with it, this tuning fork will ring. And somehow that happens. If you're in tune with God's Spirit, all of a sudden it does resonate in your heart. I'm sorry. Anyway, that's, granted, I know I'm not articulate. I used to tell people that I breathe diesel fumes for a living.
Can you talk about the priesthood of all believers?
That in Mormonism, that is a big deal. And I've been asked to teach a couple Sunday school classes on Mormonism. And I have my priesthood line of authority, and I have blocked it out so I can show that people don't realize that every priesthood member goes around with this idea that his authority comes directly from Peter, James, and John, or John the Baptist if he's an Aaronic priesthood member. And this is a big, big deal in Mormonism. I have this very simplistic, as a math major, and things are, there's this everything's binary. It's either a 0 or a 1. And anyway, Mormon, I like to boil things down to their smallest parts so I can, in my feeble brain, can capsulize this. Mormons have 2 hang-ups, and that is grace. They have no idea what grace really is. And priesthood. This idea of priesthood is just completely devastating to them. The idea of priesthood of all believers is set forth this idea that we do not need this intermediary between us and God, as the Levites were. They went to the temple to offer sacrifices. And I guess that was another dimension of my testimony. Early on, my wife, we got on these Christian book lists, and she gave me a book of the temple. I says, well, I'm going to study this out. And this is a dimension that I really should have included, is this idea. The ancient temple had one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to deal with people's sins. That is what it was there for. The Mormon temple is completely askew from that. It's there to aggrandize, to promise, to, as it were, as it says in the beginning of the endowment, to become gods and goddesses to the Most High God. The ancient temple, the Mormons say that they are a restoration, but they are not. The temple was done away with through that's what the book of Hebrews is this idea that we don't need this intermediary to go between us and God anymore. That's that priesthood of all believers.
Because we have one.
We have one. We have one already. We have a great high priest that's already done that petition for us. Anyway, and that's the short of it. And that's just a completely askew to Mormons that they need this. To think, I've got all my documents at home. I've got, I was a high priest. Well, I don't think so. Anyway, but that's just one idea that came to mind.
Questions? How long a time period was there between when your wife actually withdrew from the church and then you did? Was that?
That's a bone of contention. My wife officially left in 1990, and I really didn't leave. I didn't leave for 12 years later. In fact, when I was released as a bishop, they put me on the High Council, which we affectionately called the Dry Council, because they would go anyway. That's inside Mormon joke, but. And she says, I was going to divorce you then. She says, I thought you were done. She says, I supported you all this time anyway. So your question is a valid one. That was a big, and I honestly think because I thoroughly enjoyed being a Mormon. I enjoyed that. And so I think we have to have sympathy for these people. As I mentioned earlier, these men that I love, it's such a cultural bond. It's akin to almost, I see the Jewish community, it's what I call the Steinfeld Jews, that they're just culturally Jews, but they aren't really Jews by faith. They're just cultural Jews. And there's a parallel to that in Mormonism, because there's a lot of these. I know my wife has an uncle that doesn't believe anything, but there's no way he'd give it up because he's part of the club. And you have to realize that. As I thought about this, I had this, as I was kind of formulating what I'd say here today, this idea came to me. And again, I find my conversion basically rooted in the Protestant doctrines that are found in the Book of Mormon. And it's interesting, in the new Book of Mormon, they have the introduction page. And there's a paragraph there, and we're all familiar with the quote. It says, Joseph Smith was quoted to say that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book on earth. A man can grow closer to God by abiding by its precepts than any other book. You know what's conspicuous by its absence is you never heard that preached over the pulpit anywhere. Well, what are these doctrines that will bring us closer to God? Well, I think it's the ones that I just elaborated on. The idea of being born again. The idea that we're truly fallen men. I mean, it says, for the natural man is an enemy to God and will be forever and ever unless he succumbs to the enticings of the Holy Spirit and become a saint through the atonement of Jesus Christ. That is as Christian as it can get. But do you ever hear that over the pulpit? Do you ever hear anyone say that, as King Benjamin said, that you're lower than the dust of the earth? We don't hear that. No, we're just great people. We're wonderful people. No, there is no bad news in Mormonism. It's all good news. Well, it's modified news. And that's just it. Until you can embrace the good news of the gospel, you have to understand the bad news. And that was the beauty of the Book of Mormon. I think that's what captured me, got my attention, to realize, to see how deficient I was before a holy God. And again, can you imagine, we've all probably attended churches, the pastor would have a teaching series. Wouldn't that be a fantastic teaching series? Those principles in the Book of Mormon that will bring us closer to God than any other book. But you never hear that, do you? It's just glossed over. It's conspicuous by its absence.
Imagine it was hard for you to give up on the Book of Mormon.
Oh, yeah.
As an inspired document. Can you talk about that transition for you?
Finally, I guess what happens is when you see how defective many of the things are, like the first vision, the Book of Abraham, you just have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Finally, you've got a rotten tree there. It cannot produce good fruit. And finally, you just have to discard it. But even then, there's still, I just quoted a passage in the Book of Mormon that I love. There's a passage, I think it's in Alma 10, verses 5 and 6. I think there's a character named Amulek in there. And it was a verse that I just even love to this day. It says, I knew these things, but I did not know them. And it goes on. I'm a good paraphrase of that. And how many of us is that? They understand Christ, but they really do not know him. And the reason they do not know him is because they don't really understand their absolute need for him. They don't understand their disparity before a holy God. And that is the way that you really come to know who Christ is in your absolute need for him.
A lot of people are concerned that if they leave the LDS church and that there might not be a Christian church that will receive them, or they don't know what life will be like as a Christian, perhaps in a Christian church. Can you give?
Well, that is tough. And I found myself, when I became a Christian, a practicing Christian, I found myself self-editing myself, because a lot of Mormon speak comes out of you. And so you're sensitive to that. And what happens, I see a lot of Mormons, they're so inculcated with truth. This is truth. This is the true church. This is the true church. Finally, if that isn't true, then nothing is. And they become agnostics. I think that's kind of where some of my children are, is this idea, because they're so drilled down with this truth that Mormonism is the end all, and they don't realize that it's just a counterfeit. And I guess, let me give you an example. I remember walking into South Mountain Church when it was over here in the warehouse, and you walk in, and the first thing that hits you in the nose is the smell of coffee. And you guys don't understand how offensive that is to an active Mormon. This idea of coffee. Oh, these guys are. There's nothing good that's going to happen here, because they're drinking coffee over there. And at least in the era that I was from, I think that is the edge of that has subsided. But the Mormonism that I was raised in, that was a big deal. Coffee was a big deal. And right then, and the idea, I remember Mormons, I remember my first impression going to a service, how many times are these people going to pray? And which is fine. I understand. Fine. It's a learning process. But there is a cultural shock. There really is. Anyway, and so.
You mentioned earlier that one thing that stuck in your mind was that Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?"
Yeah.
How has that developed?
Well,
time?
that whole part of Matthew 6 is that, and then if you study it even further, well, I guess that goes to this idea of God in the box, who Christ is. But to me, the biggest rock in my shoe came from those following verses, where it says that upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. What do you do with that? I never, I prided myself as a Mormon apologist at one time. I would argue with, what do you do with this, that the gates of hell will not prevail against it? How do you deal with that? It's just so simple. I mean,
As far as the apostasy.
The apostasy, yes.
Can you talk about some of the believers that were helpful to you in your transition? Maybe even by name, some of the believers that were helpful in discipling and counseling you and befriending you?
Well, I remember my insurance agent that invited me. His name is Mark Reese. He has an insurance agency there in 90th South. He's a good man. I remember, I mentioned the Sunday school teacher from South Mountain. He wouldn't even know who he was. I call him the best Sunday school teacher I ever had. I mentioned it earlier. Yeah, senior moment here. I remember Paul Roby, some of those, and some of the guys that I went with on missions trip. Scott Bear, he's the one who baptized me. He was a pastor over there. And many of those guys again, I was the last man standing, so it says, well, why don't you lead the Bible study? And that ended up happening for 10 years. And these guys, even now, I still attend. I gave that Bible study up for about a year, and I says, well, I can't. So I went back, and it's addictive, that brotherhood you feel. I mean, it's something that, it's something that we crave. It's something that and it's a good thing. It really is, because we strengthen each other and we resolve. It's what is it? Steel sharpens steel, or whatever, flintstone. What is the scripture? Iron. Thank you. Yes, they didn't have steel then. It was just iron. Didn't have the carbon. Anyway, but yeah, and I guess some of the fantastic leaders, now I listen to Alistair Begg daily. The controversies he's in now, I don't understand. And MacArthur, the wife and I remember we went to the Strange Fire Conference down there, and we attended the Puritan Conference down there. Anyway, we look for that. And it's fantastic to have a partner that shares the same appetites. I remember other guys, their wife would be bored stiff, but my wife enjoys that as much as I, which is an absolute blessing, And
Any other questions?
Can you, you mentioned how Mormons don't really understand grace.
Oh, for sure.
Can you talk about how that understanding developed?
I remember, I'll get to your question, but let me just take a little detour. I remember my mission president made this example, and he's talking about the idea of no flesh justified, where we cannot justify ourselves through the law. And I remember telling this story. This is back before I-15 was in. People you'd travel from the center of Salt Lake, and you'd go through Draper, and you'd have to go, how many stoplights did you go through? And he says, well, here's the story, guys. You start in Salt Lake, you obey every law. All of a sudden, you get to Draper, and you run a red light. the cop pulls you over and he says, well, sir, I need to write you a ticket. I says, but sir, I obeyed every traffic light before this. That doesn't count. You broke this one. No matter, and it's a simple concept if you think about it. If you put it that simplistic, the fact that no matter how many times we obey the law, it still doesn't pardon us for the times we break the law. And that is the grace of God. And we can't earn it. We can't, I love the simple analogy. I says, when you get a Christmas gift, you ask the person how much it cost. As stupid as that example is, it just rings home that we cannot pay for this ultimate gift. I just taught a Sunday school class, and we're talking about I was asked to give the topic on forgiveness. Matthew 18, where the slave owes 10,000 talents. $10,000 doesn't mean, 10,000 talents, 10,000 doesn't mean anything for us. I made the joke, I says, you can't even buy a junk car for $10,000 now. Anyway, when you put mathematics to that, and you do the pencil of that, that's the equivalent of $60 million. $60 million. I mean, that's just one estimate, and I figured it out because I was a railroader. That's the equivalent of two, cars that would normally hold coal. Can you imagine two train cars full of gold? That's how much the debt was. And then he goes to the servant and he rings him up for $20 basically. It was 100 denarii, $20, and he strangles him. I says, that's where we are. How much we have been forgiven. We have to always remember how much we have been forgiven. That's what grace is. Well, there's no way that we can pay that back. Absolutely no way. And it doesn't matter, how many temples you go to, how much, isn't that what Matthew 7 is? It says, Lord, Lord, look at all the things I've done. No, that isn't going to do it. I've never known you. How do we know him? Because when we have this relationship with him, that we've asked for his forgiveness.